Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're looking at the women's suffrage movement,
Oh,
but with a twist.
yeah.
We're really focusing on how images,
Mm-hmm.
like photos, cartoons, even portraits,
Right.
really shaped how people saw the fight for the vote.
Interesting.
We're basing this on an episode of the American History Tellers podcast.
Yeah.
And I think you'll find it pretty fascinating how both sides of the movement
Mm-hmm.
really used images in powerful ways.
Absolutely.
You know, the expert on the podcast, Dr. Allison Lang,
Yeah.
she said something that really stuck with me.
What's that?
She said, images don't just reflect history, they actually create it.
What's that?
What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, think about it.
Yeah.
In a time before we had like TV and all that, these images were how people formed their ideas. Like,
Mhm.
imagine if all you ever saw of powerful people were older white men.
Oh, yeah.
Wouldn't you start to think that's the only kind of person who could lead?
I guess so, yeah.
It makes you think, right?
It does. So basically, suffragists were up against all
Yeah.
these fixed ideas about what women should and shouldn't do.
Absolutely. And they had to change that narrative somehow.
Right.
Visuals were a powerful tool for that. Take Sojourner Truth, for instance.
Oh, yeah. She was amazing.
Brilliant activist, really understood the power of a good portrait.
The podcast talked about how she would actually
Yeah.
distribute portraits of herself
Yeah.
to try to make activists seem more respectable.
It was revolutionary.
Yeah.
At the time, suffragettes were often painted as, radical, unfeminine.
Yeah.
But she's presenting herself as this refined, dignified woman,
Wow.
completely flipping the script.
But of course, the anti-suffrage movement, they weren't just going to
Oh, of course not.
sit back and watch.
Right? No way. They used imagery too, but to push their own agenda.
How so?
Lots of cartoons and illustrations really trying to paint a scary picture
Uh-huh.
of what would happen if women got the vote.
What kind of picture?
Like, suffragists would be shown as these ugly masculine figures,
Oh, wow.
neglecting their kids, abandoning their homes.
Really playing on people's fear.
Oh, absolutely. It was a very deliberate strategy.
Yeah.
The message was, if women get the vote, everything falls apart.
Like society just crumbles.
Exactly. Families destroyed, chaos everywhere.
Sounds a bit dramatic.
Oh, totally. But that's how they got their point across.
So both sides were really using images as weapons in a way.
Exactly, to try and win over the
The
public.
podcast also mentioned how they both used images of
Oh, yeah.
famous people to back up their arguments.
That's right. Like the anti-suffragists, they loved using Martha Washington,
Because she was
the perfect image of the traditional wife,
the supportive wife behind the scenes,
Exactly. And they'd argue that women should follow her lead.
not rocking the boat.
Right, influencing things quietly, not through voting.
It's funny because the podcast pointed out
Yeah.
that Martha Washington was the only one-uli woman on U.S. paper money
Oh, that's right.
until pretty recently,
Wow.
Talk about shaping how people think.
It's amazing, isn't it, how these little things can really reinforce certain ideas for generations.
For sure.
Yeah.
And speaking of lasting impact, the podcast also talks about Alice Paul
Oh, yes.
and her fight for the Equal Rights Amendment after women got the vote.
Interesting.
Maybe we should shift gears and talk about that a bit.
Sounds good to me.
So we were talking about Alice Paul and the ERA.
Right.
And it's interesting how even after women won the vote,
Yeah.
the fight for equality wasn't over.
Not even close. The ERA is a perfect example of that.
It seems like the arguments against it
Uh-huh.
were kind of similar to the ones used against suffrage itself.
Oh, absolutely. A lot of it boiled down to this fear
Yeah.
of upsetting the traditional roles of men and women.
And you mentioned how some women were actually against the ERA,
Right.
worried it would take away certain protections.
Yeah, it's a bit of a paradox, isn't it?
It is. It's like fighting for equality, but also worried about losing some advantages.
It's this tension that's always been there
Yeah.
in the fight for women's rights, this idea that true equality might actually put women at a disadvantage.
Like making them compete on an uneven playing field.
Exactly. And I think it makes you wonder,
Yeah.
were those concerns genuine?
Mm.
Or was it more about, holding on to a certain social order?
Maintaining the status quo.
It's complicated, that's for sure.
It is, but it really makes you think about
Yeah.
how we define equality.
Right.
And if it can truly exist when there's still so much
Yeah.
imbalance of power.
Historical baggage, you could say.
Exactly. It's like those old images and the ideas they represent.
Right.
They're still with us today.
Absolutely. They shape how we see things, even now.
And this whole idea of visual representation,
Mm-hmm.
it makes me think about who's being seen. and who's being left out of the picture.
That's a great point.
The podcast mentioned briefly how Black suffragists were often marginalized.
Oh, absolutely. Their stories haven't always been told.
Both within the movement itself and in how we remember it today.
It's a real issue, that erasure of certain voices.
It's like their contributions are being erased from history.
And that has consequences.
Yeah.
It shapes how we understand the past and how we imagine the future.
Right, and it reinforces those power structures
that we're trying to dismantle.
Exactly. This all feels so relevant to today.
It is, isn't it?
You know, we're constantly bombarded with images.
All the time.
And it's easy to just consume them passively.
Without thinking critically.
Yeah, without really thinking about what they're saying.
That's why visual literacy is so important these days.
What do you mean by that?
Being able to analyze images, to understand the stories they're telling, the perspectives they might be leaving out.
So it's about being more conscious of the images we're taking in.
More aware, more critical.
Asking ourselves, who made this image?
Right.
What's their agenda? How is it affecting me?
We need to move beyond just seeing to really interpreting, understanding.
Dr. Lang mentioned that she's writing a book.
Oh, really?
About how those iconic images from the suffrage movement still resonate today.
I'd love to read that.
Me too. It would be fascinating to explore how those images are being reinterpreted.
And repurposed.
In today's world. Like, think about the color white.
Oh, yeah.
So symbolic of the suffrage movement. And how women in politics often wear white today.
Interesting connection.
It's like a visual link to that history of fighting for equality.
Visual symbols have a way of evolving, don't they?
They do. This has been such an eye-opening conversation.
It really has.
But I feel like there's still so much more to uncover.
There's always more to learn.
Should we move on to part 3 of our deep dive?
Let's go for it.
It's amazing, isn't it?
What's that?
How all these images from the past, the portraits, the cartoons, they still kind of shape how we see things today.
They really do. It's like their power doesn't fade.
We've been talking about how suffragists really use images to challenge those old ideas about women.
Right, to change perceptions.
But it's interesting because those same tactics can also be used to reinforce those same stereotypes.
That's true. It all depends on who's creating the image and what their goal is.
That's a double-edged sword.
Exactly. Images are never neutral. There's always a message behind them.
So even though we've come a long ways since Sojourner Truth,
right?
That battle over representation, you know, like, what does it really mean to be a woman in power?
Yeah.
That's still going on.
Oh, absolutely. And it's happening everywhere, not just in politics, but in media, advertising.
Just everyday life.
It's all around us.
The podcast made me think about the ERA.
Yeah.
And how all those debates around it. That fear of changing traditional roles.
Right.
It still feels relevant today.
It does, doesn't it? It's like those anxieties are still there.
Yeah, like simmering under the surface.
Influencing how we talk about gender and power.
It's almost like those old stereotypes.
Yeah.
They become so normal.
So ingrained.
Yeah, that we don't even realize they're affecting us.
It's like they're operating on a subconscious level.
Exactly.
Shaping our reactions without us even knowing it.
It's scary when you think about it.
It is. That's why it's crucial to be aware of it.
To pay attention.
To actively challenge those biases and stereotypes.
Whenever we see them.
Whether it's in a conversation.
Or on TV.
Or online.
It's like we need to develop a new kind of literacy.
A visual literacy.
Yeah, like a critical lens.
To help us see through those images.
Understand the real message.
To decode the hidden meanings.
So it's not just about, like, being critical of the images we see, but also about using images ourselves.
Exactly.
To challenge those stereotypes.
To create a more just and representative world.
Like the suffragists did.
They showed us the way.
They used images to fight for change.
To amplify their voices.
To inspire others.
And we can do the same.
We have that power too.
Thinking about everything we've discussed.
Yeah.
What would you say is the biggest takeaway?
Good question.
What should our listeners keep in mind?
I think the biggest thing is just to be aware.
To be conscious.
Of the power that images have.
How they shape how we think.
How they influence what we do.
And to be aware of the subtle ways they can reinforce those harmful ideas.
Because with awareness comes responsibility. Right?
Absolutely.
Like, it's our responsibility to question those images.
To challenge them.
Especially the ones that are harmful.
To speak up.
We can all use our voices.
Our visual voices.
To fight for equality and justice.
It's not enough to just consume images passively.
Yeah.
We can be active creators.
Shaping the world around us.
Building a better visual landscape.
One that's more inclusive.
More equitable.
More just.
For everyone.
Wow, this has been such a fascinating deep dive.
It really has. I've learned so much.
It's clear that the legacy of the suffrage movement,
And those visual strategies they use,
they're still so relevant today.
they're still shaping our world.
So, as you go about your day,
Yeah.
really pay attention to those images you see
Everywhere.
in ads, on social media.
Even in your own home.
What are they saying about power?
About gender.
About who gets seen and heard?
It's something to think about.
It's a challenge to be more critical,
More engaged
proactive,
in how we use and interpret images.
because images have power.
And we can choose how to wield that power
Let's use it to make a difference
to create a better world.
for ourselves and for future generations.